Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 153. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 26th, where I wanted to talk about the next chapter in our textbook, and that happens to be on the internet. And I also wanted to talk about journals because those will be regular assignments for the rest of the course of the semester. And you'll remember that what I'm asking you to do with the journals is to construct about a page or so response to each of the major media that we are discussing over the course of the semester. A page is just a guesstimate. It can be as long or as short as you'd like it to be. And I am not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. So you can think of it as a kind of conversation on paper. So that by the ending of the semester, you basically will have a good summary of all of the major pieces of media that we've discussed, your reflections as well as my responses to your reflections, as well as our class discussion responses as well. I ask that you send that to me via PDF, because that's what works best with my grading program. PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, and then I will get that back to you. And because it's graded informally, I am grading it on a check mark system, which basically a plus is excellent, check plus is very good, a check is satisfactory. There's also a less than satisfactory and an unsatisfactory as well. But most of the grades end up in the higher levels. And our first journal is going to be on what we discussed last week, and that's basically the way the class is constructed, is that you'll have a journal due after we've had a reading and a class discussion, so to speak, or at least a class video about what you will ultimately be writing a journal about. So last week we talked about advertising and public relations, so that is when your first journal is due, and it will be due on Tuesday the 26th. So if you're watching this video on Tuesday the 26th, that's today, at 11:59 p.m., so basically by the ending of the day. If it turns out that you need an extension, please ask me. I'll be happy to grant you one. And throughout the course of the semester, as you can see in the course outline, you basically will have a journal due every week, or every class, I should say. And again, every class is basically the equivalent of a week, just to give you an idea of a normal semester. I didn't quite finish talking about advertising and public relations. I left you with watching Jean Kilbourne and her 40th anniversary panel discussion. And I had mentioned a documentary entitled The Persuaders that was done on PBS, and it came out in 2004, that talked a little bit also about not just advertising, but marketing and public relations. And it's a bit dated because it came out in 2004, but you can see in the notes below that what I've done is I've selected the sections that I think would be most relevant to our discussions about advertising, public relations, and marketing. They all come out to approximately 22 minutes together. Now, you can see that I've included the web link for accessing the documentary, The Persuaders, and you can watch the entire documentary if you'd like. But if you wanted to just focus on the most important sections, there's a section on clutter from minute 326 to minute 453, as you can see in the notes below under the section 1, Persuaders. It talks about how advertising is basically our environment. There's a section on history, minute 1058 to 1721, which gives an overview of the history of advertising and public relations and marketing. And then there's a section on market research, and this is at minute 2835 to 3604, and minute 3750 to 4517. And then finally, a little bit on narrowcasting. Those certainly things have become much more refined and developed in terms of narrowcasting. That would be minute 5008 to minute 5216. Which means after this, we transition over to the internet. And I had indicated that I had ultimately wanted to try to put elements of media in chronological order, but because of media convergence, in other words, the idea that multiple media vehicles are all found in one place, basically that's what the internet has done. It's transformed all media, so that you can access books, and you can access movies, and you can access music, and you name a media, you can access it through the internet. When in the past we would talk about media as separate vehicles, so television was basically focused on the transmission of that particular media through television set. You don't necessarily have to watch a television set to watch a television program anymore, but this was a program that was made for broadcasting via television as opposed to something like film, for instance. So we still use these terms, even though these terms might be a bit archaic. And what I wanted to do was just to review a few definitions and some terms about the internet before giving you a documentary to watch about the internet itself that I think will do a nice, that I think does a nice job of giving us an overview of the internet. And I'm old enough to remember the creation of the internet. So I remember the quote before unquote times where there was no internet, and then the early days of the internet, and now ultimately where we are now in 2022. And the internet was a linked decentralized, or is a linked decentralized network of phones and cables and satellites that carry instantaneously digital information that happens to be uncensored, which is wonderful and horrible at the same time, as we've all experienced. We have an incredible amount of information to access, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that information is accurate, nor does it mean that that information is appropriate. And this is something that has allowed us to communicate for either one-on-one conversations or one-to-many conversations or many-to-many conversations at the same time, and it's worldwide. So in the early days of the internet, this would be the 1990s, I remember it was labeled the information superhighway. The idea was that the internet, which ironically, it was a U.S. military government project from the 1960s, and it was meant to create a decentralized network for communications so that in the event of a national emergency, we could continue on with our communications. I say ironically because the military is so centralized, and yet they created this decentralized mode of communication. And we talked about it as the information superhighway, that not only would it allow communication among scholars and academics and the government, but it would also be a kind of storehouse of information that we could access. We didn't have enough vision to really understand what the internet would become in terms of global communications and in terms of social media. And this project in the 1960s, ARPANET, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Military and Academic Communication. Email. And this was electronic mail that, again, was meant for communication. We know that now what email has basically descended into is the equivalent of junk mail. Most email is now spam. And microprocessors, these were miniature circuits that processed and stored electronic signals. Initially invented in 1971, the advancements in them helped to lead to the advancements we have with the formation of the internet and its development since then. So the World Wide Web. Now, this was a text data linking system that was developed in the 1980s by a software engineer by the name of Tim Berners-Lee. So in some ways, you can say that he really is the creator of the World Wide Web. At CERN, this is the European Organization for Nuclear Research, Switzerland. If you've ever seen any of his lectures or discussions, it's really interesting in how he envisioned the internet. He basically saw it as a vehicle for all of us to use for free. So he didn't take any profit from it, which is very rare in today's world. He never expected that it would be used so nefariously in some of the ways that it is used now. So his newest project now is to enable users to have levels of privacy, which they don't have necessarily in the current formation of the internet. The web browser, as I'm sure you know, it's software that helps to navigate the web. And I do remember AOL, the internet service provider of the 1990s, that basically was the most popular internet service provider before broadband. And they used television cables. And yes, it was very, very slow. Of course, with broadband, you have the quick download of multimedia content. And it also meant you could use your phone while you were also using your internet. And then search engines, automated mathematical algorithms to locate web content. And I do remember purchasing a book in the early days of the internet that basically listed all of the websites that could be found on the internet. At that point, they could actually be documented. Of course, it's expanded exponentially, so there's no way that we could keep track of something like that. Now, something that's very important that we're going to be talking about over the course of the entire semester is in section 3 of our notes: business interests and centralization. One of the most important dates for a class like this is 1996. This was the Telecommunications Act, and it removed regulation restrictions in telecommunications. What this meant is there was the possibility of having legal monopolies, in effect. Of course, you know, a monopoly, ownership of too much by one person, is illegal. But we've got something pretty comparable if you think about our days of having these basically 4 or 5 players in the world of the internet. You can think about Jeff Bezos. You can think about Bill Gates. You can think about Steve Jobs. So it's a handful. So one person that we will definitely talk about is Rupert Murdoch. It's going to be particularly important when we talk about journalism. And Rupert Murdoch created the Fox television network and eventually Fox News. But I'll save that for when we get to the journalism section. Digital communications. This is basically where we've got image, text, and sound electronically converted into binary numbers. These are 1s and 2s. So that this is how we transmit information. Social networks, which is, again, something that Tim Berners-Lee never, I think, imagined. Things like social media, digital platforms encouraging users to create their own content and to comment and to interact, which is wonderful and horrible at the same time, as we've experienced with our social media. Blogs, digital content that could be posted in chronological order. And I do remember that before the Moodle days, I actually had blogs associated with my class. And wikis, these are collaborative web content sites. Probably the most famous is Wikipedia. And I'm not necessarily averse to Wikipedia, but there are more scholarly sites that you can use. Think of Wikipedia much like any general encyclopedia, like the Encyclopedia Britannica, in that basically you're just getting a summary rather than the original source of information. And because anyone can post anything, there is the possibility of error or deliberate deception. Now, Wikipedia has cleaned up its act since the early days of Wikipedia to try to have individuals not post incorrect information and to remove posts that are incorrect as soon as possible. But again, if you happen to be in that small window when something was posted, whether it be deliberately or mistakenly, that is incorrect, and that's when you access that information, obviously, then you don't have a solid piece of information in your scholarship, which is why you want to use Wikipedia more for quick fact-checking, not for serious scholarship. And then virtual worlds, where we've got interactions in 3D environments. And of course, when you think about something like Facebook and Zuckerberg's idea of the metaverse and where that will go, none of us know because it's under development. But what he is envisioning from the reading that I've done is this 3D world that would be as realistic as our own world. So this really would be a virtual reality. Now, convergence, as I was talking about earlier, this is the technological merging of mass media content, which is what the internet did. It basically is a way to access all other media. Digital divide, a term you might have heard of before, that this is the disparity between those with and without digital access. And we can view this not just from a global perspective, but also from a local perspective. Anybody who lives in the hill towns, I suspect, would tell you about the difficulties they have with their internet as compared to, let's say, other areas in Massachusetts. Net neutrality, the idea that every website and user should have the same internet access and speed. And this is quite controversial. If we did not necessarily have equal access, which is what Tim Berners-Lee had envisioned, then that would obviously give preference probably to people with power and privilege. And we know how when people with power and privilege have access, that usually means they increase their power and privilege. And that means that others lose power and privilege. Doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but certainly history has shown it to be that way. And of course, we know how Apple changed the world with mobile devices and handheld computers, and of course, the smartphone. So a phone that basically is a computer, a much more sophisticated computer actually, than the computers used to put the men on the moon, just to give you some comparison. That's what we carry in our pockets and purses. The issue of internet privacy is another problem, or at least challenge, of the internet. Phishing, we know that internet identity theft is alive and well. Spyware, where secret information gathering software is used to find information about users. Though oftentimes the web is constructed in such a way and that users voluntarily give up their information. It was the whole model behind Facebook in its day. Data mining, data collecting systems. It's become a business and an industry in and of itself. And the question of whether it is even possible to have privacy in this electronic world. And cookies, the automatic collection and transfer of information profiles. And of course, once we get to something like COVID-19, and I had asked you how you thought perhaps media had been influenced by COVID-19, video communications have become increasingly important. Think about Zoom, which I think that from a business perspective, what Bill Gates did was absolutely brilliant. And that's not to say that he didn't necessarily have an altruistic motive as well. But in the early days of the pandemic, Zoom, which I can say I had no idea what Zoom was prior to the pandemic, and I suspect many people would say the same. Basically, Zoom was something that you could use for a limited amount of time for free, or if you wanted additional minutes, then you would have to sign up for a subscription. And during the pandemic, Gates eliminated all of that so that ultimately we could all use Zoom as a communication vehicle during lockdown without having to worry about time limits. And again, from an altruistic perspective, it was very useful in terms of being able to keep our society functioning. But from a business perspective, it was also brilliant, because once he reverted back to the previous payment model, all of us had become, well, addicted for some of us, but if not addicted, at least accustomed to Zoom, and that was the vehicle that we decided to continue using for our teleconferencing for the most part. So all of this, keep in mind as you're watching the documentary, and this is in section 3 in the notes below, The Internet Revolution and the Digital Future of Technology. Came out in 2018. It's approximately 51 minutes long. Gives a review of the internet, and it talks a little bit about some of the ways that, at least from 2018's perspective, the internet could change over the course of the future. Again, about 51 minutes or so. And I thought that after you would watch that and this video and watch or read our textbook about the internet, you would be in a good place to answer our attendance question that will be on our class discussion forum and due on Thursday the 28th. And that would be at 1 p.m. Though certainly if you need additional time, let me know and I'll be happy to grant it to you. To list one strength, to list one challenge that the internet is experiencing, or that you think the internet will be experiencing. There are lots of different challenges that are related to the internet, and I just covered a few of them. So as you think about your own usage of the internet and the way that the internet has influenced you and your behavior, what do you think is one of the biggest challenges of the internet? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about books, one of the oldest mass media vehicles. Take care. Bye-bye.